I moved to Stillwater for peace, a small, unassuming town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills. But what I found instead was a living nightmare. At first, everything seemed perfect. The friendly faces, the quaint shops, and the whispering pines surrounding the town like protective sentinels. Yet, there was something off about Stillwater, an undercurrent of unease that slithered beneath its picturesque facade. People were too polite, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes, and the nights were too quiet, as if the forest itself held its breath. My unease began to deepen when I noticed how the townsfolk would always lock their doors before sunset, their shutters drawn tightly, their lights dimmed to a faint flicker. One evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I ventured out after dark. The moon hung low, casting elongated shadows across the cobblestone streets. As I wandered aimlessly, I felt it, a presence, cold and heavy, pressing against my back like unseen eyes watching my every move. The sound of soft footsteps followed me, but every time I turned around, the streets lay empty. The next day, I overheard hushed whispers at the local diner about the Watcher, an ancient legend of a figure that roams Stillwater at night, a creature of shadow with eyes like molten coals. They said it was drawn to outsiders, feeding on their fear, and that no one who truly saw it survived to tell the tale. The words seemed absurd, but I couldn't shake the dread that gnawed at my sanity. That night, I stayed up, staring at the darkened window, determined to see for myself if the Watcher was real. Hours crept by until the clock struck 3, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural whisper from the hall outside my room. My blood froze as the doorknob rattled slowly, deliberately, as if testing my resolve. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flung the door open, but nothing was there. Nothing except long, deep scratches gouged into the wood of the floorboards, trailing into the darkness. I should have left Stillwater then, but something held me back, a morbid curiosity that outweighed my terror. Over the following days, the encounters escalated. My reflection in the mirror would smile back at me, even when I wasn't smiling. Objects in my house moved when I wasn't looking. A chair pushed closer to my bed, a knife left lying on the counter that I swore I hadn't touched. And the dreams, oh God, the dreams. They were filled with images of a gaunt figure, its elongated limbs bending unnaturally as it crawled toward me in endless darkness. I started losing time, waking up in places I didn't remember going to, with dirt under my fingernails and blood, not mine, staining my clothes. When I confided in the townsfolk, their reactions were chilling. Some avoided me entirely, while others simply whispered, "You've been marked." The final straw came when I woke up in the woods one night, surrounded by a circle of dead animals, their eyes hollow and their mouths twisted into silent screams. In the center of the carnage stood the Watcher. Its skeletal frame loomed impossibly tall, and its fiery eyes bore into my soul, paralyzing me with fear. It raised a spindly hand, pointing directly at me, and a deafening chorus of whispers erupted from the shadows. "Run," they hissed. So I ran, tearing through the forest as branches clawed at my skin and unseen things scuttled in the periphery. When I finally stumbled back into my home, panting and bleeding, I found a note on my bed written in my own handwriting. "It's not over." I left Stillwater the next morning, but even now, far from that cursed town, I feel it watching me. Its presence lingers in every shadow, in every mirror, in every creak of the floorboards at night. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. And when it does, I fear I won't be able to run anymore. I came to Ash Hollow, a forgotten town deep in the wilderness, chasing a lead on a story, a journalistic itch I couldn't ignore about strange disappearances over the decades. The town was barely a dot on any map, a cluster of decaying buildings shrouded in a mist that never seemed to lift. The air smelled of damp earth and rot, the kind of smell that clings to you, crawling into your lungs and refusing to leave. From the moment I arrived, something felt profoundly wrong. The people moved like shadows, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow, avoiding questions with murmured platitudes and quick steps away. Even the children were silent, their play unnervingly subdued, their laughter non-existent. I checked into the only inn, a creaking relic with wallpaper peeling like dead skin, and as night fell, I realized why no one lingered outdoors after dusk. It began with whispers, faint and unintelligible, echoing from no discernible source. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to old pipes or the wind, but the whispers grew louder as the hours dragged on, until they surrounded me, seeping through the walls and wrapping around me like icy fingers. I couldn't sleep, and by the time dawn came, the whispers faded, leaving only an oppressive silence heavier than the sound itself. The townsfolk avoided my gaze when I mentioned it the next day, but one old man grabbed my wrist with surprising strength as I passed him on the street. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "You heard them, didn't you? The Hollow remembers." I pried his fingers off me, unnerved by his intensity, but his words haunted me. That night, curiosity overrode fear, and I ventured outside with a flashlight. The streets were deserted, the windows of every house dark and shuttered. As I walked, the mist seemed to thicken, swirling unnaturally around me, muffling every sound except the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. And then I saw it, a figure at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the faint beam of my flashlight. It stood unnaturally still, its shape indistinct, like smoke given form. I called out, but the figure didn't move. Instead, the whispers returned, louder than ever, rising to a cacophony that made my head throb. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness, and in that moment, I felt it. A breath on the back of my neck, cold and damp. I turned, swinging the flashlight wildly, but nothing was there. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I stumbled back to the inn, slamming the door behind me and locking it. That was when I noticed the mud on my shoes wasn't just mud. It was mixed with something darker, something that smelled coppery. I couldn't explain it, but dread curled in my stomach like a coiled snake. Over the next few days, my sense of reality began to fray. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find myself standing at the window, staring out at the forest as if waiting for something. Objects in my room moved when I wasn't looking. A chair shifted closer to the door. My notebook opened to pages I hadn't written. The whispers became a constant presence, their tones rising and falling like some twisted conversation. I tried to leave, but every road out of Ash Hollow seemed to loop back into town, the mist swallowing the path no matter how far I drove. The townsfolk stopped acknowledging me entirely, their movements becoming mechanical, like marionettes on invisible strings. Desperation drove me to the town's library, a decrepit building filled with dust and crumbling tomes. That's where I found it, a brittle, handwritten journal buried beneath a pile of forgotten books. Its pages told of an ancient ritual, a pact made generations ago to keep the town alive. In exchange, the Hollow demanded sacrifices. Those who came to the town uninvited, lured by its whispers, drawn into its trap. The last entry ended abruptly. It watches. It waits. The final night, I woke to find myself outside, barefoot and freezing, standing at the edge of the woods. The whispers were deafening now, and the figures, dozens of them, emerged from the mist, their forms flickering like broken reflections in a dark pond. They surrounded me, their voices weaving together into a single, chilling phrase, "The Hollow hungers." I tried to run, but the ground beneath me gave way, and I fell into darkness so complete it felt like drowning. When I woke, I was back in the inn, but everything was wrong. The town was empty now, utterly devoid of life, the buildings crumbling into ruins as if decades had passed overnight. My reflection in the cracked mirror wasn't mine. It stared back at me with eyes black as voids, a faint, twisted smile curving its lips. I've been here ever since, trapped in a place where time doesn't exist, where the whispers never stop. If you're reading this, you need to stay away from Ash Hollow. It's not a town. It's a mouth, and once you enter, it never lets you go. I arrived in Ravenswood under the heavy skies of late November, seeking solace from the chaos of the city and an escape from my own failures. The town was a forgotten relic, hidden deep within a forest of skeletal trees that seemed to claw at the heavens. The people spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling as if the very act of speaking might summon something unspeakable. There were no cars, no cell towers, and no electricity save for dim gas lamps lining the cobblestone streets. It was a place out of time, shrouded in an eerie stillness that clung to my skin like frost. From the moment I arrived, I felt watched, not by the townsfolk, but by something else, something unseen yet omnipresent, lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision. The locals were reluctant to answer my questions, avoiding my gaze and offering cryptic warnings about the woods surrounding the town. They called it the Vale, a place of old curses and restless spirits, and told me never to venture past the ancient stone wall that encircled Ravenswood like a crumbling fortress. But curiosity is a cruel master, and that first night, as the clock struck midnight, I found myself drawn to the edge of the forest, the dense fog rolling in like a tide. The air grew colder with each step, my breath visible in the dim glow of my lantern. Beyond the wall, the forest seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets to one another, their gnarled branches forming grotesque shapes in the gloom. Then I heard it, a low, mournful wail, like the cry of a dying animal, echoing through the stillness. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, my footsteps crunching on the frostbitten leaves, until I reached a clearing. In the center stood an ancient well, its stones blackened with age and its mouth covered by a rusty grate. The wail grew louder as I approached, emanating from the depths below. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to peer into the darkness. As I lifted the grate, the lantern flickered and died, leaving me in pitch blackness. That was when I felt it, an icy hand brushing against mine, its touch sending a jolt of terror through my body. I stumbled back, dropping the grate with a deafening clang, and fled the forest, the wail following me all the way back to town. That night, my dreams were filled with shadows, faces twisted in agony, and a voice whispering my name over and over. When I woke, the whispers continued, faint but unmistakable, coming from the walls of my room. The locals grew even more distant after that, their faces pale and drawn, as if they knew something terrible awaited me. The whispers followed me everywhere, growing louder whenever I neared the forest. By the third night, I could no longer bear the suffocating dread and decided to leave Ravenswood. But every road led me back to the same place. The forest loomed like a predator, its branches stretching out to ensnare me. Desperation drove me to the church, a crumbling relic at the heart of the town. Inside, I found a journal left by the last priest, its pages filled with frenzied scrawls about a pact made long ago, a sacrifice to keep the town safe from the Vale dwellers, ancient entities bound to the well. The priest had sealed the well with a blood offering, but the barrier was weakening, and someone, an outsider, would be needed to renew it. I realized with dawning horror that I had been lured here, chosen by the town for a fate worse than death. That night, as the fog thickened and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo, the townsfolk came for me. They surrounded my room, their eyes black and empty, their mouths moving in silent prayer. I fought them off, escaping into the forest, but the trees seemed to close in around me, forcing me toward the well. The grate was gone, and the wail had become a roar, a symphony of anguish that pierced my very soul. The ground trembled as shadows poured from the well, their forms shifting and writhing like liquid darkness. They spoke in unison, a guttural chorus that made my ears bleed. One must pay. Before I could react, the shadows enveloped me, pulling me into the abyss. I screamed, but no sound escaped, the darkness consuming everything. My sight, my thoughts, my very existence. When I awoke, I was back in my room, but everything was wrong. The town was empty now, the buildings reduced to charred skeletons, the sky a permanent twilight. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence, and my reflection in the cracked mirror showed eyes that were no longer mine. I am the watcher now, bound to the well, waiting for the next outsider to wander into the veil, to take my place in the endless cycle. If you ever hear whispers calling you to Ravenswood, turn away and never look back, for once you enter, you will never leave. I never intended to stay in Gloamridge. It was supposed to be a stopover, a forgotten town nestled in a valley so deep that the sun barely kissed its cobblestone streets. My car had broken down on the outskirts, and with no cell service and night falling, I had no choice but to seek help. The town greeted me with an uneasy stillness, its streets deserted, and its buildings leaning as if they were weary of standing. A single inn stood near the square, its dimly lit sign swinging in the cold breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the innkeeper, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, offered me a room without a word, her skeletal hand trembling as she handed me a rusted key. The room was small and oppressive, the wallpaper faded into indecipherable patterns, and the lone window overlooked an empty courtyard cloaked in fog. That night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the hall outside my door. I called out, but no one responded, the silence pressing against my eardrums like a vice. The footsteps stopped, and when I dared to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty. Sleep eluded me after that, my mind replaying the sound over and over until dawn finally broke, though the sky remained a dull, ashen gray. The townsfolk were no more welcoming in daylight. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes darting away whenever I tried to speak to them. One old man, his voice a raspy whisper, told me to leave before nightfall, his words punctuated by a desperate urgency that chilled me. But my car remained dead, and no mechanic could be found. As the sun dipped behind the hills, a dense fog rolled into town, thicker and darker than before, swallowing the streets whole. The innkeeper barred the door and windows without explanation, her eyes wide with fear. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, and accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their cadence rising and falling like a sinister chant. I pressed my ear to the door, and for a moment, the whispers stopped, only to be replaced by a guttural growl, low and primal, that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I stumbled back just as something heavy slammed against the door, the impact rattling the entire room. My breath came in ragged gasps as I grabbed the chair and wedged it beneath the doorknob. But the pounding continued, each blow shaking the door until I thought it would splinter. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt deafening. The whispers resumed, but now they came from the window. I turned to see shadows moving in the fog outside, their shapes indistinct yet undeniably human, or at least they once were. Their elongated limbs and jerky movements defied nature, and their glowing eyes burned with a malevolent hunger. One pressed its face against the glass, its mouth stretching impossibly wide in a soundless scream. I scrambled back, clutching a lamp as if it could offer some protection, but the creatures didn't try to enter. Instead, they circled the courtyard, their whispers growing louder, weaving together into a haunting melody that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The innkeeper burst into my room, her face pale as death, and dragged me into the basement, where a dozen other townsfolk huddled in silence, their faces etched with terror. She explained in broken sentences that the shadows were the remnants of Glomridge's past, a curse born from an ancient pact made to save the town from famine. The price had been steep. Every 100 years, the town was required to offer a guest to the shadows, a sacrifice to keep them at bay. My presence had unwittingly fulfilled that role, and now the shadows wanted me. The townsfolk looked away, guilt and fear warring in their hollow eyes. The innkeeper handed me a rusted knife and whispered, "They only take the living," before retreating up the stairs and locking the door behind her. Panic clawed at my throat as the whispers grew deafening, the basement walls trembling as the shadows seeped through the cracks, their forms coalescing into grotesque shapes. I backed into a corner, clutching the knife, as they surrounded me, their eyes glowing brighter, their whispers now a deafening roar. I tried to fight, slashing wildly, but the blade passed through them as if they were smoke. Their cold touch enveloped me, pulling me into their darkness, and the last thing I heard was their chant turning into laughter, cruel, mocking, endless. I woke up in my car, the engine purring softly, the morning sun bathing the valley in golden light. Glomridge was gone, replaced by an overgrown field and crumbling stones that might have once been buildings. I drove away, the town fading into the rearview mirror, but the whispers never left. They follow me now, growing louder each night, their chant a constant reminder that some things cannot be escaped, only endured. And I know it's only a matter of time before the shadows come to finish what they started. Bleak Haven wasn't on any map I owned, and I only found it because I got lost. My GPS had died hours ago, and the road signs were rusted, their words long since faded. A storm was brewing, the kind where the sky turns a sickly green before the heavens split open, and I needed shelter. Bleak Haven appeared like a mirage, its crooked houses lining a single street that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The place was unnervingly quiet. No cars, no people, just the howl of the wind and the occasional creak of wooden shutters. I parked my car near what looked like a general store, its windows dark and covered in grime, and stepped out into the oppressive stillness. The air smelled wrong, like burnt metal mixed with something sickly sweet, and the sensation of being watched settled over me immediately. I tried the door of the store, but it wouldn't budge, so I wandered further into town, calling out for anyone who might help. My voice echoed back at me, distorted, as though the town itself was mocking my presence. The storm broke suddenly, rain hammering down in icy sheets, and I took refuge in a nearby inn. The place was ancient, its walls sagging inward, and the lobby was lit by a single flickering bulb. A man stood behind the counter, his face gaunt, his skin stretched thin over his skull, and he didn't seem surprised to see me. "Room's ready," he said before I could even speak, sliding a key across the counter. His voice was hollow, as if it came from a great distance, and when I asked about the town, he only muttered, "Just stay inside after dark." I should have left then, but the rain was unrelenting, and exhaustion weighed heavily on my limbs. My room was small, the bed covered in a threadbare quilt, and the window overlooked the main street, now cloaked in an unnatural fog that writhed like a living thing. As night fell, the town transformed. Shadows stretched too long, their edges sharp and deliberate, and the fog thickened, swallowing the world beyond the inn. I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate, but when I checked, the hall was empty. The whispers began around midnight, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder, forming words in a language I couldn't understand. They came from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet, and I realized with a cold dread that I wasn't alone. Something moved outside the window, a tall, spindly figure, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. It stood motionless, staring up at me, though it had no eyes, only gaping sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. I stumbled back, but when I looked again, it was gone. The whispers grew frenzied, overlapping and echoing until they became a cacophony that made my head throb. Then the lights went out. The inn was plunged into pitch blackness, and I fumbled for my phone, but the battery was dead. The air grew colder, and a faint blue light began to seep through the cracks in the walls, pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low hum that vibrated in my chest. I stepped into the hallway, clutching a candlestick I had grabbed as a makeshift weapon, and the floorboards groaned beneath me. The air felt heavier with each step, and the walls seemed to close in, narrowing the corridor until I could barely move. At the end of the hall was a door I hadn't seen before, its surface covered in strange, shifting symbols that glowed faintly. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I opened it. Beyond was a room far too large to fit within the inn, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not my image, but shadows of other people. Figures with hollow faces and desperate eyes, banging on the glass as though trapped within. In the center of the room stood a well, its edges carved with the same glowing symbols, and from it emanated a sound so low and deep it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. Something moved in the shadows, circling the well, and I realized it wasn't a figure but many, dozens of them, their movements jerky and unnatural, their forms blending into one another like smoke. They stopped in unison and turned toward me, though they had no faces, only empty voids where features should have been. A voice boomed, not from them but from everywhere at once. "You are the next." My legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as the shadows surged toward me, their touch cold and searing all at once. I fell backward, slamming the door shut, and ran back to my room, though the inn had changed. The walls pulsated like living flesh, and the doors were now gaping maws, snapping at me as I passed. I barricaded myself inside and sat in the corner, clutching the candlestick like a lifeline. The whispers returned, soft and mocking, and the figure from before appeared outside the window again, joined by others. They surrounded the inn, their eyeless faces staring upward, their mouths stretching open in soundless screams. I don't know how long I stayed there, but when dawn came, it brought no relief. The sun was a pale disk in a blood-red sky, and the town was silent once more. I ran to my car, but the road out of Bleakhaven led only back into the town, looping endlessly no matter which direction I took. The shadows still watch me, growing closer with each passing night. I write this now, trapped in this place where time doesn't seem to move, hoping someone finds it. If you come across Bleakhaven, turn around and never stop driving. Whatever lives here will not let you leave. Ashwood Hollow wasn't on any map, and if it weren't for my flat tire in the middle of nowhere, I would have never set foot there. The road had vanished into dense woods, and the skeletal trees, Their branches, gnarled like clawed hands, loomed over me as if trying to keep me out. But with no cell service, night falling, and the air growing cold enough to sting my skin, I had no choice but to follow the dirt path that seemed to lead to a clearing. The first sign of life, or what I thought was life, came in the form of an old wooden sign hanging askew. "Welcome to Ashwood Hollow." Population? The numbers had been scratched out, leaving behind deep grooves in the wood. The town was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. The houses were small, all of them seemingly abandoned, their windows shattered, their doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Yet, there were candles burning in some of the windows, flickering weakly as though they struggled to stay alight. I thought perhaps I'd find help at the church at the end of the street, its steeple leaning precariously to one side. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, carrying with it a strange metallic smell mixed with rot. When I reached the church, I noticed the doors were chained shut, and the words "Stay out" were carved deeply into the wood in a frenzied hand. But I heard faint voices inside, low murmurs that sounded like chanting, and I banged on the door, desperate for help. The voices stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Then the chains on the door rattled as if something on the other side had tried to open them. I backed away, but before I could decide what to do next, an old man emerged from the shadows of the alleyway beside the church. He was hunched, his face a map of deep wrinkles, and his milky eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice trembling but firm. "They know you're here now." I tried to ask him what he meant, but he shook his head violently and pointed toward the woods. "Leave. Leave before dark. You still have time." He didn't wait for me to respond, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. His warning chilled me, but my curiosity overrode my better judgment. Instead of leaving, I decided to explore further, wandering down the main street where the town seemed to grow darker, the daylight dimming unnaturally fast. That's when I noticed the figures, just at the edges of my vision, watching from the windows of the decrepit houses. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, their eyes hollow and unblinking. Whenever I turned to get a better look, they vanished, leaving only the faintest impression of movement in the shadows. The whispers began soon after. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind, only the still, oppressive air. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, murmuring my name in tones so soft they were almost tender. I tried to follow the sound, thinking perhaps someone was playing a cruel joke, but the deeper I ventured into the town, the more disoriented I became. The streets no longer made sense. They twisted and looped back on themselves, leading me past the same broken fountain in the center of the square over and over again. By the time I realized I was trapped, the sun had set completely, and the town was swallowed by darkness. That's when I saw them. At first, they were only shapes, tall, impossibly thin, their limbs too long, their movements unnaturally fluid as they emerged from the shadows. Their faces were featureless save for their mouths, which stretched wide in grotesque grins that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light of the distant candles. They didn't move toward me immediately. Instead, they circled, their heads cocked to the side like curious animals. I ran, heart pounding, but the town seemed to shift around me, every street leading back to the fountain where the figures stood waiting, their numbers growing with each pass. The whispers grew louder, turning into an incomprehensible cacophony that drowned out my thoughts. I stumbled into a house, slamming the door shut behind me, and found myself in a room filled with photographs. They covered every inch of the walls, all of them faded and torn, depicting the same people over and over again. Men, women, and children with faces frozen in expressions of terror. In the center of the room was a single chair, and on it sat a mirror, cracked and smeared with what looked like dried blood. Against my will, I stepped closer, drawn to the mirror as though some unseen force compelled me. When I looked into it, my reflection wasn't my own. It was one of them, a pale, grinning creature with hollow eyes. I screamed and stumbled back, knocking over the chair. The sound seemed to awaken something in the house, and the walls began to pulsate, the photographs peeling away to reveal writhing shapes underneath. I bolted out of the house and into the street, but the figures were waiting for me. They moved faster now, their long arms reaching out, their mouths opening wider, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. The old man appeared again, standing in the middle of the street, his face contorted in anguish. "They never let anyone go," he whispered, his voice carried to me as though by the wind. "You're part of them now." The last thing I remember is their hands, cold and unyielding, pulling me down, their whispers turning into laughter. When I woke, I was standing at the edge of the woods, my car tire fixed and the engine running. But I can't leave. No matter how far I drive, the road always brings me back to Ashwood Hollow. And now, when I look in the mirror, my reflection isn't mine anymore. It's theirs. The town of Ravenshade wasn't supposed to exist, or at least that's what I told myself when I stumbled upon it during a desperate search for gas late one fog-drenched night. My GPS had failed me, leaving me to navigate winding, unmarked roads deep within a forest that seemed to go on forever. When I saw the faint glow of street lamps through the mist, relief washed over me. But as I drove closer, something felt profoundly wrong. The air grew dense, heavy with a smell I couldn't place. Something earthy and metallic, like freshly turned soil mixed with rust. The first building I saw was a gas station, its sign flickering dimly, reading "Last Stop." It looked abandoned at first, but the pump still worked, so I filled my tank while nervously glancing around. That's when I noticed the utter absence of sound. No insects, no wind rustling through the trees, not even the distant hum of cars. The silence pressed down on me like a physical weight. Still, I convinced myself it was my imagination and decided to venture into the town proper, hoping to find a diner or someone who could point me back to civilization. But as I drove further into Ravenshade, my unease deepened. The houses were old, their architecture Gothic and crumbling, with ivy crawling up the sides like veins. Dim yellow lights flickered in some of the windows, yet there was no movement, no signs of life. The streets were lined with statues, grotesque figures frozen mid-scream, their eyes wide and their mouths agape in terror. Each one was eerily detailed, as though someone had captured their final moments in stone. Against my better judgment, I parked my car and stepped out, drawn by a strange compulsion to explore. The cobblestones beneath my feet felt oddly warm, and as I walked, I noticed the statues weren't entirely stationary. In the corner of my eye, I could have sworn one turned its head, but when I looked directly, it was still. The fog thickened, muffling my footsteps and obscuring my view, but I pressed on, drawn toward the faint sound of music. It led me to a decrepit carnival ground at the edge of town, its rusted rides barely visible through the mist. The music came from a carousel that turned slowly, its painted horses worn and chipped. Shadows moved between the rides, and I thought I saw children running and laughing, but their laughter was hollow, echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I called out, but my voice sounded small and wrong, swallowed by the oppressive air. As I turned to leave, I saw her, a little girl in a tattered dress standing by the carousel. Her face was pale, her eyes too large, and her smile too wide. She didn't speak, just raised a hand and pointed toward the Ferris wheel. Against all reason, I followed her direction, my body moving as if under someone else's control. The Ferris wheel loomed above me, its gondolas swaying gently despite the lack of wind. At its base was a small booth, and inside sat a man whose features were obscured by shadows. His voice was a low rasp, more like a hiss than speech, as he asked if I wanted a ride. Before I could answer, he grabbed my wrist with icy fingers and shoved me into one of the gondolas. The wheel creaked to life, the ride slow and deliberate, and as I ascended, I saw the town spread out below me. But it wasn't just Ravenshade. Beyond the edge of the town, the forest stretched on endlessly, and within it were other towns, identical to this one, each cloaked in the same suffocating fog, their streets lined with screaming statues. At the apex of the ride, the world seemed to tilt, and suddenly I was no longer in the gondola but standing in the town square. The statues surrounded me now, their faces impossibly close, and I realized they weren't made of stone at all. Their flesh was cold and rigid, their eyes glassy but still alive, darting to meet mine. I tried to run, but the cobblestones seemed to shift beneath me, tripping me up and pulling me closer to the largest statue in the center of the square. A towering figure with wings made of bones and a face that was a swirling void. Its mouth opened, and from it came a sound so terrible, so piercing, that I fell to my knees, clutching my head. It spoke no words, but its meaning burned into my mind. "You are home now." I woke up in my car, the engine idling and the gas tank full. The fog had lifted, and the road stretched out before me, but when I tried to drive away, the car wouldn't budge. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches intertwining overhead, plunging everything into darkness. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness again was the sound of laughter, deep, guttural, and endless. Now I am here, wandering the streets of Ravenshade, a prisoner of its twisted reality. I see newcomers sometimes, their faces etched with the same confusion and dread I felt. I try to warn them, but they can't hear me. And when I look at my hands, I see cracks forming in my skin, hardening into stone. Soon, I will join the others, my face frozen in terror, another silent sentinel to welcome the next unfortunate soul who stumbles into this cursed town. I had never intended to return to Blackwood Hollow, the town where I was born and where my nightmares began. It was a place cloaked in perpetual twilight. Even on the brightest days, the towering black pines surrounding it casting elongated shadows that seemed to move when no one was looking. My mother's funeral forced me back, though, a solitary drive through miles of dense, unbroken forest on a road that seemed forgotten by time. The first sign of the hollow was its ancient wooden bridge, its planks groaning under the weight of my car as I crossed over the river that snaked around the town like a moat. The water below wasn't water at all, but a thick, black sludge that smelled of decay and faintly pulsed, as if alive. My skin prickled as I approached the town center, where buildings stood like sentinels, their windows dark and empty. The air was heavy, charged with a static hum that made my teeth ache, and the streets were eerily void of life. Yet there was a presence. I could feel it in the way the shadows clung to the edges of the cobblestones, watching, waiting. I parked in front of the church, its spire piercing the gray sky, and made my way to the cemetery where my mother was to be buried. The funeral had been hastily arranged, and the priest, a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who spoke in whispers, rushed through the rites as though eager to leave. The few attendees were strangers, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats and veils, their silence unnerving. As the coffin was lowered, I felt a peculiar sensation, as though something beneath the ground was stirring, and when the final clump of dirt hit the wood, A faint sigh seemed to emanate from the earth itself. That night, unable to sleep in the creaking, mildew-stained house that had once been my childhood home, I wandered the town. The streets were unnaturally silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, though there was no wind. Doors creaked open as I passed, revealing dark interiors where faint whispers echoed. I told myself it was the wind, but deep down I knew better. Blackwood Hollow had always been different, cursed perhaps, though no one dared to speak of it openly. My mother had once told me never to look into the old well at the edge of town, a relic from a time before the hollow had a name. As a child, I'd often wondered why, but now, drawn by a morbid curiosity, I found myself standing before it. The stone rim was slick with moss, and the iron grate that once covered it lay twisted and broken beside the opening. Peering into the abyss, I saw nothing but darkness, an all-consuming void that seemed to pull at me, whispering my name in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. A faint light flickered deep below, and before I knew it, I was climbing down, my hands gripping the cold, damp stones. The descent seemed endless, the air growing colder and thinner with each rung, but the whispers grew louder, urging me on. At the bottom, I found myself in a cavern, its walls glistening with a black, oily substance that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. In the center stood a figure, tall, gaunt, and cloaked in shadows. Its face was featureless save for two glowing eyes that bored into my soul. It didn't speak, but its presence filled my mind with a torrent of images. The townsfolk standing in a circle, their faces contorted in terror as they chanted in unison. A monstrous entity rising from the well, its tentacles stretching out to consume the light, and my mother, her hands stained with blood, standing over a book bound in human skin. The figure extended a hand, and I felt an overwhelming urge to take it, but at the last moment, I turned and fled. The climb back to the surface was a blur, my heart pounding as the whispers turned to screams, and when I emerged, the town was alive with movement. The shadows had come to life, writhing and twisting through the streets, their forms grotesque and unrecognizable. The church bell tolled, though no one was there to ring it, and the air was filled with a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very ground. I ran to my car, but the engine wouldn't start, and when I looked back, the townsfolk were emerging from their homes, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved as one, their steps unnaturally synchronized, and their mouths opened in a silent scream as they advanced toward me. I ran, leaving everything behind, my legs carrying me through the forest and away from that accursed place. Now, as I write this from a motel room miles away, I can still feel the shadows watching, waiting. My reflection in the mirror isn't quite right, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again, calling me back to Blackwood Hollow. I fear I've brought something with me, something that will never let me go.